You're live, Madam Chair.
Okay, we're back. This is House Corrections and Institutions Committee. It's in the afternoon on Wednesday, January 25th. We're kind of shifting a little bit from going through our projects to getting a little bit of background information. We've got our legal counsel, Becky Wasserman, and our joint fiscal analyst, Dan Dickerson, here to give us some history and background on the establishment of the cash fund. We talked about this last year in this committee, and we worked with the Appropriations Committee and with our Senate colleagues in setting up the cash fund, but kind of waiting to see how it played out over the summer and fall, and then the Finance and Management is due back with a report about the cash fund and how we go forward with funding the cash fund. The intent of the cash fund, in theory, was that the money that was put in when we left here, it was about 8 to 9 million that was put into the fund when we left the session. The intent was for those dollars to be used for the capital construction projects for that. So I'll turn it over to Becky. Becky has the language that was put in, and the language was put in the appropriations bill, I believe.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Becky Wasserman, Legislative Counsel. So it's correct that the language that establishes the cash fund was put in last year's Budget Bill, Act 185. And the cash fund was put in statute in Title 32. And so it was, subsection A creates the fund, which is administered by Finance and Management, and the treasurer is consulting on the administration of the fund. And the purpose of the fund is using general funds to defray the costs of future capital expenditures that would otherwise be paid for using the state's general obligation bond authority and debt service obligations. Subsection B, the fund what can be put into the fund is any appropriations or transfers made by the General Assembly and any interest that's earned by the fund.
So let me stop you there. So the funds, so how money gets in according to this? How money gets in there is any appropriations that we do and any transfers that we do into the fund. Okay. So, okay.
And then in subsection C on that point, any expenditures from the fund have to be made by appropriation. So anytime money goes out of the fund, the General Assembly has to appropriate that expenditure. The plans for how the fund should be used are to be submitted as part of the operating budget adjustment or operating budget process. So what the governor recommends in the budget process or budget adjustment process. And the money in the fund can only be used for a few specified expenditures. So first is costs associated with a proposed capital project that occur prior to the construction phase of that project, including feasibility, planning, design, and engineering and architectural costs. The second is projects with an anticipated lifespan of less than 20 years. Costs associated with the early redemption of general obligation bonds, and then other eligible capital projects that receive an appropriation from the legislature.
Wayne?
What would be costs associated with early redemption of general obligation?
So I think if somebody is redeeming, well, maybe Dan can speak to that better. So if they're redeeming a bond, they get paid the full principal and then interest to date on my bond. So I think it's the cost associated is my understanding of that.
Administrative costs.
Dan Dickerson, joint fiscal. If you, the General Assembly, decided to appropriate money from this fund to pay off bonds, so let's say it's a $1 million worth of bonds, then you would appropriate $1 million to pay off the bonds. So it'd be principal, interest, and then if there are administrative costs, it could be that as well.
So we could use the cash fund to pay some of our obligation, our debt service.
Subsection.
So we have a question, hang on, Kristen?
Thank you. There was a part of this you mentioned about it goes under appropriations committee. What goes under, I just want to make sure I got it straight in my head. Does the use of the fund go under appropriations or under? In this?
You mean how
expenditures are made from
are
that
made?
fund?
So it has to be by an appropriation of the General Assembly. So that is expenditure shall only be made from the fund by appropriations by the General Assembly. So I guess it could, if it's general fund dollars, that would typically be through the appropriations committees. But it doesn't specify that.
I think that means that, like, the capital bill is in effect because it was approved by the General Assembly. So it's a whole legislative act.
Right.
It's the whole body that votes on a bill.
Okay.
But our bill, when we get it done, our bill goes up to Appropriations Committee because it's part of the bigger budget. It's part of that $8 billion state budget. So it's not that they're appropriating it, but it's in the world of the money. And then the General Assembly, the full House votes on the capital bill, and then the full Senate votes on the capital bill. So it's a whole General Assembly that's giving authority.
My question was, I'm just trying to understand the jurisdiction of that, sort of where the buckets fall of jurisdiction for committee. And we have jurisdiction of the capital bill. Is the use of these funds as part of the capital bill any different? I think is my question.
So I think this is actually a question that the committee has to figure out how, like, what bill this will, and how it will be presented in a bill, because it just hasn't really been done before. So the way the governor presented it was that the cash fund appropriations was in the capital bill spreadsheet. So I think it's an open question about how you want to reflect that, either in the capital bill, those appropriations made from the cash fund, or if it's going to be reflected in the big bill. I think the transportation bill is an example where the authorities are in the T-bill, but the appropriations for those authorities for those projects are in the big bill. So that could be an example of how you do it, but I think that's just part of the discussion of how to reflect the cash fund in legislation.
And that gets really dicey in our world because we have a project that, if you look at our spreadsheet, we've got some projects that have both bonded dollars and cash fund dollars. So if you do part of that project is in the capital bill and then the part of that project is in the big bill, it's really hard to track the money because they're in two separate bills. And then it's a legal quagmire for our staff to make sure the language refers to both bills. Then if you're trying to track it in out years, then you're looking at two different pieces of legislation.
So is that the intent? The intent of putting this cash into the capital budget is so that we have this tracking, and we don't have that.
But we don't know. That's what Becky was saying. We have to address that as a policy in terms of where does it sit. So we don't know. What we ended up doing last year, we didn't use all of our bonding capacity. So we saved about 8 to 9 million in our bonding capacity last year when we did the capital bill. And then 8 to 9 million that got in the cash fund came through a separate mechanism to go in there, which I hope you can go into. Maybe, maybe not.
None of the cash money came from ARPA funds, is that safe
No.
to say? No, okay.
As far as the movement of money, do you want to just hold up on that until I'm the chair?
Yeah.
Good with that. Okay, so subsection D says that the balance in the fund at the end of the fiscal year shall be carried forward and remain part of the fund. And I believe last year there was carried forward this year. And then there is some language on early redemption transfer in subsection E. So it says that if any expenditures are made from the fund or the General Assembly appropriates funds to pay for early redemption of bonds, then an amount equal to the reduction in debt service required in every fiscal year resulting from that redemption is transferred into the fund. So my understanding of what this means is that typically the debt service payments are coming out of the general fund. So if you are using this fund to pay off, make those payments, what would normally have come out of the general fund for those payments would be transferred back into that fund. Kind of like backfill the payments.
So if you pull money out of the cash fund to pay off some bonds, what you would end up saving in the long run on your debt service line item in the general fund, that amount that is saved would then be transferred to the cash fund. And the amount that would be saved would basically be interest and principal. Folks follow that? Some did and some didn't.
Oh, would it be principal, would just be the
Interest, or would it be?
remaining interest, right? I mean, because you always have to pay the principal.
But the principal is part of your debt service line.
The debt services principal.
Oh, you mean it's a savings from what normally comes out of it?
So say you've got $20 in debt service, in your debt service line, you got $20. That includes principal and interest. And then you get this cash fund, and say you've got enough to pay $10 worth of, you can redeem your bonds in early. So you're paying $10 out of the cash fund to pay off those bonds, which means you're saving $10 on that $20,
That's,
or not.
I think the point that Becky was making is that that isn't a savings, because it's just, it's a dollar for a dollar. What you are saving is the interest. But in this construct, the principal that you no longer have to pay in the future that would have been budgeted in the future budget year will circle back into the fund, as well as the interest that is a true savings would circle back.
Sometimes you get it and sometimes you don't.
I think there's like this, the savings that year from what the general fund normally pays into debt service. But then there's the longer term interest savings of if you pay something off 5 years earlier, then you're not paying that 5 years of interest. So that's like a sort of long-term interest, savings to the state for not having to make those payments.
Wayne?
And it makes sense. So, if you had a bond out there for 10-year bond, and you had a total amount of interest for that whole duration of time, and you paid off half of it early, then you're not gonna have to pay that extra interest. So that would go into this fund. What would confuse me a little bit, if the principal that you paid off would also go in there, because normally that principal would go back into the bottom line of the capital fund, right? No?
No, the principal is currently paid for out of the general fund from debt service payments.
So why wouldn't it go back into general fund?
Well, because this language is directing it to go, but otherwise it would,
So they're
it
providing
would
a
just be
funding
more
mechanism.
money.
They're providing a funding mechanism for this fund.
Sort of.
Sort of, yeah.
Sporadic funding.
Yeah. So, and the next section of the bill, the big bill, asked for a report from Finance and Management in consultation with JFO and the state treasurer. So they were asked to make some recommendations on the cash fund. First was a dedicated revenue source or state fiscal capacity to fund the cash fund. Yeah, there was a typo. I knew this. And any revenue source or state fiscal capacity that is identified, they were asked to do an analysis of the benefits and costs of dedicating this revenue source to the cash fund in comparison to other identified unfunded state fiscal pressures. They were also asked to come back with some proposed amendments to statute creating the fund, including if the uses of the fund should be prioritized in statute, so that lists of 4 ways that money can be used coming from the fund. How to prioritize the use of the fund to emphasize strong financial management in state government. If an allowed use of the fund should be to use it for internal state debts or deficits. And an allowed use to include state assistance for projects to mitigate emergent health and safety needs.
So that goes beyond the capital bill. And that's what the report is to address, if we should do any of this.
And then subsection B asks for the report to come back to the Appropriations and Institutions Committees by last week. And my understanding is it will be coming soon.
Questions? So according to this language, that cash fund, we've got to figure out how it gets funded. And then it appears as if the question is, can it be broadened, the use of it, can that be broadened beyond just our capital budgets for planning purposes, up to construction documents, to bidding? Can it be used for other uses besides capital bill? And that's what the report back from Finance and Management that they're still working on, that once they get it, we'll be reviewing that report.
So what is not definitive in here will become more clear or instructive when we get that report.
Well, they will make recommendations,
Okay.
and then it depends if we put anything in statute
Okay,
about it. That will be part of our work, and that will be part of appropriations.
okay.
Justin?
Thank you. Just on a basic level, I think I still want to understand better why we decided to create a fund for this money, for the spending, versus just
Doing it?
paying for it. Is it to sock away money in an interest? Or is it to kind of control it in a certain way?
Well, it was a proposal of the administration, so I can't speak to why they proposed it. I mean, I think
They proposed it, we got rid of it, and then it came back in the Senate.
I think
It's a history.
I think there are policy arguments for it in terms of the General Assembly. Yeah, you can specify what can come out of the fund, and so you can sort of control what you do want to dedicate it to capital-related expenditures. You can control what projects get it, rather than, it if you're just doing like a pay-go funding with no controls around it, that could be sort of harder conversations each year.
It's a way of saying, if I can, sorry, but if I can jump in, it's a way of maybe the legislature saying, okay, we want to spend a chunk of money with a certain intent, and we're gonna kind of hold ourselves to that intent by putting it into this fund and calling it a certain thing.
Yeah,
Sort of.
I think because, and Jane can talk more about this, but because they're also kind of, their plan was to dedicate a certain amount of money going into it from the general fund, they have this idea of how much would be available.
4%.
4%,
Yeah,
that was
so
the proposal.
rather than leaving it open every year for the legislature to say like, this year we might want to, we could spend 10% or whatever it is, I think it just creates more of a
Structure.
structure and like a long-term plan for how to pay for the project.
Thank you.
Troy?
Why did you get rid of it?
Well,
Yeah, I mean, the quick version.
and why did we get rid of?
You said this.
We got rid of it and then the Senate put it back.
Yeah.
We weren't really sold on the idea in that, I think there was a few moving pieces that we're not opposed to looking at cash when it's appropriate to replace our bonded dollars for capital projects. We've done that in the past. It's been like a one-time thing when we had a lot of surplus dollars. This particular proposal, there was a couple of things. One is it locks in the general fund to, and I think at the time was 4%, to move 4% into this cash fund. So what happens when you're in a deficit? Because you're not always going to have surplus. So it's going to put additional pressure on our general fund. So you do that, and some years you could say, hey, notwithstanding this 4%, we're not doing it. Which then puts this committee and the capital bill in a bind because the bonding capacity has been lowered because they know there's cash that's going to come in. So it was the pressure on the general fund that was one issue. The other pressure was what's to ensure that if we put $10 million in this cash fund for next year, the debt affordability committee won't decrease our bonding capacity by that amount. And they assured us they wouldn't do that. Well, they did do that. So then that puts more pressure because we've got some big projects and it puts more pressure on our bonding capacity because their recommendation was decreased. The third thing is we legislators are really great. If we know there's some cash hanging around and we have our particular little project or program that we want to get started, well, we have this cash fund over here that we can just go to and pull money out. We're really good at doing that as a legislative body. So those are kind of the reasons that came out of this committee, and appropriations had those same concerns.
Was the treasurer's office supportive?
Oh, yes,
Yeah, I would think.
it came from the treasurer's office.
So you could have statutory uses for the fund, but that could also be.
Notwithstanding.
So, you could have that list in statute of what you can use the money for, and then 1 year say, notwithstanding of that, we'll use it for this.
So the concern really is there a way to fund our projects that keeps us stable in our financial world for the credit agencies and the structure of our finances? Is there some mechanism, something we can do so we're not always putting things on a credit card? I mean, it's kind of how you run your household. If you know you've got some big expenditures coming up, sometimes you do have to take a loan or home equity. Other times, maybe I'll put aside money for 3 months and then I can pay cash for this. It's kind of that kind of thinking.
Automated saving. Every paycheck, I'm going to put aside 10%. Just force myself to do that, even if I don't want to.
Sort of. But then you don't, then your kids, if they knew that you had this little cash put aside, but they won all this money for something, right?
Well, I told my son about my new salary.
I mean, it takes a lot of discipline, legislative discipline, not to go to a cash source. And when you have a surplus, there is a feeding frenzy in this building, because everybody thinks that there's money out there for their little program. And you're building the base. You're building the base, and next year you gotta build that in your budget. So when you have a surplus, it really gets squirrely in this building. When you have a deficit, people know there isn't enough money to go around, so they're a little more reserved. But last year, with the policy bills that were coming into approps, after approps had basically were putting their budget together, after they reached out to the respective policy committees, there were a lot of little bills that came in that had appropriations on it, and it came up to almost $500,000, no, it was more than $500,000, wasn't it? I can't remember. It was pretty substantial, and appropriations committee was going, wait a minute here. We don't have that kind of money. So the fear is if you've got cash hanging out there, people are gonna go after it.
Policy bills are more generally constructed by need rather than availability.
By
Don't you
wants.
think?
Some of
Okay,
it is
want.
wants.
Okay, you can go there, but yeah.
Some of it is wants.
But rather than availability, I mean, we review the policy, we ship that out to appropriations, and then they decide.
And they
that's
say no.
That's right. And they do. But that's how they arrive later than, because these bills come out and they have little pieces that require some funding.
But if you have an appropriation on a bill, that committee should reach out to approps before they move it out of committee.
Yeah.
So approps can anticipate this in the budget, or just say, hey, we don't have the capacity in the budget. What are you guys thinking? Because there is a disconnect between your policy committees and your money committees. There's a real disconnect.
Yeah. Well, that generally happens with a larger expenditure. It's these little
That add
pieces
up.
that come. Yeah, that's true. They do add up.
They add up.
But they're little pieces that come to be because something is injected into a bill that costs
Well, you could have,
$100,000.
right, you could have 100,000 here, you could
Yeah.
have 120
Yeah.
over
Yeah.
here, you
Yeah.
could have 300 over
Certainly
here.
that
First thing you
happens,
know,
yeah.
you're in a few millions.
Yep.
You don't have that capacity. It's like, it'd be very equivalent to people introducing legislation and then appropriating our capital dollars and saying, you know, I want 50,000 for this, I want 200,000 for this, I want 500,000 for this, and we're limited to 104,000 for 2 years. We're limited, 108,000, we're limited to 54 million in FY '24, and first thing you know, you could have bills coming out from policy committees that want $4 million of that for capital infrastructure. It's like, what? So the cash fund was pretty well debated and questioned, and the other body really wanted it. So they ended up putting it in, and then it was negotiated in the appropriations world.
What was their rationale on the other side? Was that shared?
Governor's proposal,
Oh, okay.
particularly on Senate institutions.
Okay.
So this language this was embedded in the approps bill? Okay.
Yes. So as you're seeing in our capital budget, in FY '24, there's about 8 million plus coming out of the cash fund in FY '24. In FY '25, there's 10 million, so 10, 11 million. So there's a total, there's 25 million in that cash fund as of now. So what the administration is proposing, is over 2 years, we pull 20 million from there. And appropriations may have a different thought.
They might.
But then I asked yesterday, and I think the projected reimbursement is around 17.
Reimbursement,
You know, if just 4%.
I don't think.
After we
It'd be 17, I don't think, is it 17 million? if appropriations committee agrees to 4%. They could end up at 1%.
And that's high right now due to the federal dollars.
No, it would be just general funds, right? It's,
General fund is elevated right now due to all the federal funds that.
okay,
So because the general fund,
it's so high.
they're doing a look back for this 4%, because the general fund is so significant as compared to our debt service, it's gonna result in this relatively large 17 million. If that policy passes.
If it's the 4%.
And then it would go back down because the general fund, our economists estimated the general fund's gonna go down.
We seeded this one time with 25 million, there's 20 in there. And now we're being asked to consider spending that 20 million. Is that accurate?
And more. Because they're also proposing of the general fund surplus of FY22.
Right, but that's not funneling through this.
No, but it's still impacting appropriations.
Sure.
And it is, they are proposing to transfer 62 million from the general fund to capital expenditure cash.
Oh, they are.
That's how the mechanism would work.
So that's right, that gets to Tristan's question, right? Because that's essentially what we're doing. If you put $25 million in there last year, see it, and now you're gonna spend 20 million this year?
Over 2
One,
years.
what's that?
Over 2 years, but yeah.
But that's
Yep.
essentially just a,
I mean, why not just do it from the surplus?
right, it's just a smoke and mirrors a little bit, right?
That's why we didn't want to do it.
And then if it doesn't, right, if this 4%, I don't want to call it a skeeze, but 4% doesn't pass, then essentially we've just spent general fund surplus over these 2 years. That was put in there last year.
Yep.
I think one of the things that this committee has to consider with this is just the coordination it requires with the appropriations committee. So they have to accept that 4% and accept it every year, because again, they could change it. And as you're building your bill, you won't really know how much money you have to spend until they've decided how much money is going to be appropriated into the cash fund, which is often not until kind of last minute.
It's not until the middle of May.
Yeah, so I think that's just another complication of having a fund like this where there are two committees that have to sort of sort out how much money they have, and while you're trying to plan for each project that you're going to fund.
So in FY24 alone, we have about $70 million of our 54 million. We have 54 million bond. If you go to the last page on the spreadsheet, just for FY24, we've got, for the cash fund, we have 8.3 million for FY24. And we have 62 million of the general fund surplus. So we've got $70 million of projects in our capital bill that's being funded by the surplus, by cash. And we have 52.7 million that is being bonded for. That's what the governor has proposed. That's on line 195. And then in FY25, they're not doing surplus dollars, but they're saying from the cash fund, there would be 10.8 million going to our capital projects. from the cash fund. So more than half of our bill, capital bill, 2-year bill is coming, almost half is coming from cash. Because we're only allowed to bond for 104 million and our capital bill total is 203 million. So we're at the mercy of Appropriations Committee. For this.
More than usual.
Well, usually we're not
Yeah.
at the mercy of approps. Because we very seldom use general fund for our projects. If anything, we have tried to help the Appropriations Committee in the past with some, because sometimes we can find more capacity in the bonding world, particularly when they're in dire straits in their budget. We have helped pick up some things that were eligible for bonded dollars, like some VECB projects, things like that.
When do we find out if they are on board?
Well, that's going to be our work from now until March, April, May, because we can agree to something on the House side.
Yeah.
And then it gets over to the other body and it can be totally different. And then you get into conference committees and then our budget's tied in with the appropriations budget that's tied in with the conference committees and it can, then you just don't know.
Then the other consideration is, how much interest savings are we gonna have by not bonding this amount of money? Because that's a perk, that's something that's gonna be good for state government, so that's a selling point, I would say. Is, I don't know, it should be a considerable amount, but what is the amount that we will save by spending cash instead of bonding this money over the duration of time the bond is gonna be?
That's where you have joint fiscal office do those analysis. But you also have to think our bonding capacity that we had for the past 4 years was 123 million. And we're down to 108. And lo and behold, we have a cash fund.
Those are two different things in a sense, because if our bonding, we're using a credit card. So we're not gonna be able to use the credit card as much. But when we have the cash savings, that's cash savings going back into state government. So that's correct, but it's two different thoughts.
I think the tricky part to the question that you're asking is if we didn't have the cash fund available, would these projects happen? The likelihood is no, because the bonding capacity is 108 million. The General Assembly has typically stuck to that. So when we call that savings, I think you just have to say we're blessed by having this nice surplus that allows us to do these things that we would not otherwise be able to do.
So the thought there is that we might lose some bonding capacity. But is that bonding capacity exceeded by what we can get done with the cash? See what I mean? Because we can only do so much work with the money that we've got. But now we have this cash. By using the cash, we can actually get more dollars out the door than relative to the decrease in the bonding rate. The amount of bonds we'd be able to purchase. So we still could have an upside on that cash fund.
Depends what Appropriations Committee does.
Right.
They may not agree to that.
And it really depends on what the general fund does. I mean, there's, let's say you pass this 4% mechanism and then 2 years down the road, you decide, we now want to shift our meals and rooms tax revenues back to fully going to the general fund, whereas now it's split between the general fund and the ed fund. That's going to result in huge general fund growth that, per this mechanism that you are considering, would result in a lot of money going to the cash fund. But it's not tied to reduced debt. It's tied to just shifting where existing revenues go.
Right.
Or if you decrease personal income taxes, that's going to result in the cash fund, on paper, owing money to the general fund. because the general fund would be shrinking. And so there are a lot of scenarios that no matter how disciplined the General Assembly and future governors want to be, would result in you having to not withstand that calculation because of a multitude of possible factors.
And then what plays over that is your debt affordability committee is saying, well, you got this cash over here, so your bonding capacity, we're gonna recommend a lower bonding capacity. So then all of a sudden this cash isn't there and you're squeezed.
If you used, I mean, I don't know, if you use that $60 million this year, it's about 60 million, right?
Uh-huh.
To just
62 million.
not pay for any projects, but just pay for debt service payments. Would that increase your bonding capacity?
That's a treasurer / CDAC question.
Some of the language would have suggested that the intent of the Senate was to have some relief for the capital budget. I mean, that language that we just reviewed seemed to suggest that.
No, it was to shift more paying cash versus bonded dollars.
Right, well, that's basically what I meant. I mean, but relief, yeah. But you're right, the possibility of losing bonding capacity as a result of spending the cash is a real thing.
That was a big concern here in this.
Yeah.
Yeah. If I had to speculate, I would think if we took that 62 million and paid down bond debt, our bonding capacity the next biennium would not increase by 62-ish.
Maybe 54,
It might go back up a little bit, but
60 maybe.
You can also be taking it away from the state colleges.
So I'm wondering if we really should think of this in the real long term as opposed to the short term. 2 years, I mean, this legislative body can change anything at any time, so there's no assurance that what we build isn't going to disappear in 2 years or 3 years, right? So right now, we have perhaps the opportunity to get planning done for projects we want to have on the ground and do it now. It'd be a different kind of thing if we had the capability of building a system that was funded through time, and we have stability and ensured that everything we wanted to do would work. But I don't know if we're able to do that.
Well, and then that feeds in what Gina asked this morning. So we can put in all this planning, and then what if the project doesn't go forward for 10 years because you don't have the capacity to put the money aside for construction? So the figures you figured out that the project would cost are 10 years old or 8 years old or 6 years old, and they're not accurate. So those are the balancing thoughts that we need to do for that. Dan, do you want to come up and explain anything more?
a lot of points that I raised that already been discussed, but there might be a few other items. So I submitted a document that should be on your page. The first part of this is really what Becky already walked through, just discussing current law. There are three main bullets here. First is the General Assembly did create this cash fund in Act 185 of last year, which was the big bill, sort of set this structure in place as far as what the fund is and what it can do. And then it required an analysis from Finance and Management, a draft of which I have seen. And we were able to weigh in as well as the Treasurer's Office. And so that's why the report hasn't been issued is our office really felt like if it takes a little bit longer to get something that we feel more comfortable with, then by all means, and same with the Treasurer. And Finance Management was good with that to their credit. But I will say, and I think Secretary Clauser hinted at it yesterday, is that the proposal is going to be, as far as the funding mechanism, is going to be pretty much the same as what it was last year. And that's what the report will reflect. And I think at this point, I don't know that our office agrees or disagrees. There's certainly complications with putting that in place, and I'll talk about those shortly. Then as far as the funding, Act 185 did direct the transfer of any surplus, a piece of any surplus revenues totaling 25 million to the capital expenditure cash fund. So basically there was this waterfall language in the big bill saying, to the extent that there's a surplus of general fund at the end of FY22, which was the most recent fiscal year, the funds shall be utilized in these ways. And within that waterfall was this cash fund transfer of 25 million. And in addition to that, there was this appropriation to the treasurer's office of 20 million to direct the treasurer to call back any existing bonds up to that amount. And within that provision, it directed any savings from that 20 million of callback to go into the cash fund. So, assuming the treasurer had immediately turned around and paid off those bonds on July 1st, then at some point during FY23, we would have had to make an interest payment and a principal payment of about, I think their analysis last year was about 6.3 million. So 6 million principal, 300,000 interest. That amount would have gone into the cash fund. But that money has not gone out the door. I imagine part of the reason is that the treasurer was going to change, and so
That 20 million.
no. But one question that has been asked by a couple of senators now, and we've passed along to the treasurer's office, is because you still have this 20 million, does it make more sense to just use that, as part of the capital bill and avoid future debt at a much higher interest rate and pay off existing debt? So the treasurer's office is working with their bond counsel, I believe, to give us a recommendation on it. So 20 million still exists. It's sitting in, it's an appropriation. They have not used it to pay down debt. We would, if the General Assembly decided to utilize that money differently, there would need to be language in the bill to do so. But we are researching that.
So Dan, that first one, the 25 million of surplus revenues to be put in the cash fund, was that 25 million, do you know if that 25 million was intended for capital projects or if it was just a placeholder? The fund was a placeholder to hold that 25 million.
I would say, based on my conversation with other JFO staff, so I can't speak for individual legislators, but what they took from that is it is money set aside for capital-ish projects.
Capital-ish projects, right.
So not necessarily something that would traditionally go into the capital bill. Part of this analysis that finance management is supposed to provide is, are there other higher and better uses? School construction is one big, thing out there that, is a challenge. And so, having this extra pot of money could result in that being brought back in, which, really doesn't increase the capacity at all. It probably decreases capacity because there's so much need out there in the school construction realm. IT projects are another piece. I know the General Assembly did create a special fund for that, but there's no funding mechanism for that fund. So if we were to authorize this 4%, do you split those funds between the capital expenditure fund into this IT? So I say capital-ish because I don't think, as with the 25 million, I don't think that they're gonna, I doubt they're gonna pull that back and deploy it for something that's not capital-ish.
And what the governor's proposal is that over 2 years, 20 million of that, about 19 million of that 25 goes to the capital bill for 2 years.
But under their proposal, it would be replenished.
With the 4%
And if that's not agreed to, what are they gonna do with that? With that 19, yeah.
It would
That's what it
be,
grows.
yeah,
It's
the
a
appropriations
gross.
committee would use it on something else. Big bill, whether, it could be a one-time or it could be
I mean, we've got a lot of general fund, we've got $100 million of general fund dollars. over 2 years in our capital bill.
And that's never the case.
This is the weirdest capital bill that we've had, and I don't know, my time being here. We have paid, there was a couple years, I know, that we didn't bond at all for our capital bill. We had the projects in our capital budget, in our capital bill, but the money, we had enough surplus that the money all came from the general fund. And this was a few years prior to that, when we built the last correctional facility and a tech center, because we paid 100% of our tech centers in our local school districts. And this was back in the late 90s and early 2000s, around 99, 98, 99, 2000. We were building the correctional facility that was 27 million. And we were building a tech center, and that came in at about 14 million. Those two projects were done at the same time, and we paid cash for those two projects. And then I think one subsequent year after that, might have been in 2001 or 2002, we had enough cash, but our capital bills were only 35 million at that time. They were in the mid to high 30s. They weren't 60 or 80 million dollars. And we had enough surplus that we paid for cash for those projects. But that was done for that particular session. We only had capital bills that were 1-year capital bills. We didn't have 2-year bills at that time. So those are situations where we didn't want to bond. We had the capacity in our surplus. What this proposal does, that has been put out there, constricts the general fund, constricts appropriations committee at some level, depending how healthy the general fund is. So if we're in a deficit, which we are, we cycle in and out. It's usually over an 8 to 10 year period, we cycle. And when we have deficits, it's really difficult. And then if you're going to pull money away from that, and you're not going to pull very much money either. And those could be years that the appropriations committee says, no, we're not going to put money into the cash fund. And then you're locked in with a recommendation from CDAC for your bonding capacity. And that's been decreased over time because you've been doing cash. So that's what you got to look at long term too.
I don't know how much longer you have, but
5 minutes.
on the back of this, so there's another section here where I've discussed what I believe the administration will propose in some way, shape, or form on this cash fund. And I sort of listed the assumptions that need to be made in doing an analysis, whether it's JFO or finance management or the treasurer's office, as far as like what is the general fund going to do going out? What is CDAC going to do? What are future governors? I mean, there are a lot of question marks to this. And then what are the new pressures that will arise? And then really big picture, as far as, the time that you're going to take, the testimony and the questions that you're going to have on this cash fund between, this committee and the appropriations committee. Some of the questions I have are, as far as with the governor's, the administration's proposals, what happens in a really good general fund year, what happens in a bad general fund year? If we're going to go with the 4% mechanism, do we create caps on the top and the bottom to say, there's not going to be a scenario where the cash fund owes the general fund money. Let's nip that right now. And then how will CDAC and rating agencies react? I think we got a sense of how CDAC is going to react this past year, although we now have a new treasurer, and I don't know if the treasurer is going to install. I think they get one appointee on. So I don't know how that's going to change the dynamics and what that's going to do. But are the rating agencies going to care that we have this statutory allocation mechanism, or are they just going to care that we're borrowing less? I don't know, I could probably speculate, and I'm not gonna say that in public because I would very well be wrong, but I think those are good, if you have the treasurer in at some point, that might be a good question for them to answer or for them to pass along to their bond counsel. Does the general fund percent allocation need to be in statute? Or do we just tell the administration in statute that you'll come up with a recommendation based on the 4% and bring that to the General Assembly? So it's not 4% is getting transferred automatically to this cash fund, but the governor is at least starting at a baseline recommending the 4%, but it could be modified in years where something, the general fund drops or you institute some big tax change that would result in, a huge amount of money going to the cash fund that really isn't intended to go there, or the other way around. Who is best suited to administer the fund? I think in the language I pulled a lot of these questions from when I went through a similar document last year because I thought they were all still pretty relevant. But I think the language that was proposed had finance and management administering the cash fund, and does it belong with the treasurer or elsewhere? And then does general obligation debt service include all funds? There have been some limited issuances tied to the transportation fund. So do we want to make sure that we're not looping them into this feedback system? And then this question really came up, but how does the General Assembly deal with this because of the jurisdictional questions? I know Becky mentioned that it could be something like the T-bill where you authorize projects that would be funded with cash fund dollars, and then appropriations makes the appropriations in the big bill, or maybe appropriation says, no, well, you can appropriate this money. But those are questions that definitely need to be answered. Obviously, the dynamics between those committees will change as general assemblies change. But it's definitely, I would say that it definitely sets committees up for potential conflict in the future, for better or for worse. Yeah, I think the idea of reducing our debt is a good one.
Torn?
So you've introduced the term mechanism, probably better than scheme. Is this based off anything? Is this working somewhere? Who came up with this idea?
Yes, there is a basis. I think when that analysis gets issued by finance and management, I think they'd be able to speak to it better than I knew it last year, and I've forgotten. I've since forgotten.
That was the question I asked last year.
Yeah. Yeah. Somebody came up.
Well, it seems like I remember the treasurer saying, was it?
Beth came in and talked.
Yeah, but where she worked at one place, it wasn't in Vermont.
Connecticut or something.
Yeah,
Happened to be in
Connecticut.
Massachusetts.
Yeah, Connecticut, they had a pay-go system. And that's what she was looking at.
And then finally, I just sort of called out what is proposed in the capital bill that pertains to the cash fund. So there's 25 million in the fund currently. The administration is proposing to spend 19 million of that existing balance. Plus, they're proposing to transfer 62 million from the general fund for IIJ match and state colleges, a few things. But then, if you were to authorize what will be their proposal when the analysis comes out, that fund would be replenished. Yeah.
It's $80 million.
It's a big piece of the capital.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And
Big
that
chunk.
is all I have.
So our capital bill is at the mercy of Appropriations Committee, in essence. John?
Your interest rate we're paying on the older bonds.
I don't know that, but I think that the treasurer's office.
It's not be exact,
has-
but I get 3%, is it that low?
I think it's probably a mix of 3 to 5%, depending on whether they're just, you know, the par bonds or whether they're premium bonds. So I'd say it's in that range.
And really, you must have an idea what a new bond interest rate would be, or something that you're looking at.
I want to say there was an internal discussion about the report a few days ago, and I want to say that 5 to 6% was tossed
So
out
they aren't
there.
that far apart then. Wow, they are.
Well, you know, a par bond was previously around 3%, so it definitely has gone up.
Wouldn't the CDAC report have all of that?
I don't know that it lists all of our outstanding. It sort of lists the cumulative debt, you know, the $580-ish million, but I don't think it goes into each bond issuance and then lists, you know, what the rates are. But the treasurer's office does have a webpage where they have those listed, so you can open up the documentation and see, you know, for each issuance. There hasn't been an issuance since May of 21. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while.
It's a big backlog of authorized but unissued debt.
And one other question, did you hear any rumblings of what they might be plans for the ed fund surplus?
I don't.
Property tax rates. It's usually the proposal from the administration that gets put back into lowering property tax rates. But we can't tap the ed fund for our projects here.
I know.
Anything else? Well, we will be revisiting this a number of times and talking about cash and bonded dollars a number of times. So thank you, Dan. Thank you, Becky. We'll have you back.
Wait to hear from the bond. So repo members, next week we may have a list and Dan will meet us when we decide to.
So let's take a really 5-minute break because we're going to shift gears here. We've got Department of Corrections coming in to give us an overview of their medically assisted treatment program. This committee was pretty instrumental in putting together this program within our correctional facilities, so I thought it would be good for us